Hello everyone, welcome back to Sleepy History Tales. Before we get started tonight, I want to say a very special thank you. The channel has just officially reached 1000 subscribers. This is a very meaningful milestone, and it is all thanks to your support, listening and companionship over the past time. Thank you very much. And now, as a little habit, where are you watching this video and what time is it? Maybe you are lying in bed, getting ready to go to sleep, or sitting alone in a quiet room. Try leaving a comment to let me know. I always love reading your thoughts after each video. Tonight, we will embark on another journey together. A cold and mysterious corner of history. In the spring of 1829, on a quiet stretch of farmland near the Delaware-Maryland border, a tenant farmer made a discovery that would unearth one of the darkest criminal enterprises in early America. His plow horse suddenly gave way beneath the soft earth hooves, sinking into the soil as if the land itself could no longer hold its secret. The farmer dug frantically and unearthed a weathered wooden chest. Inside were the skeletal remains of a man. His bones had yellowed with time, but the skull bore unmistakable signs of violence. And that, dear listener, was only the beginning. Over the weeks that followed, investigators uncovered more hidden graves on that very property, at least 7 people in total. Among them were 3 children. Their deaths all traced back to the same chilling figure, a woman whose very name was spoken in whispers across the Delmarva Peninsula, Martha Patty Cannon. For nearly 20 years, Patty Cannon orchestrated a criminal network that history now calls the Reverse Underground Railroad. While the true Underground Railroad fought to bring enslaved men, women and children to freedom in the North, Patty's network worked in the opposite direction, kidnapping free African Americans and escaped slaves to sell them back into bondage in the Deep South. But Cannon's crimes went even deeper than trafficking. She was a murderer, cold, deliberate, and ruthless. She silenced rival traders, eliminated witnesses, and killed children if they posed even the slightest threat of exposing her operations. Court documents from Sussex County, Delaware, show she was indicted for 4 murders, but witnesses swore the number was far higher, perhaps over 20. Before we continue with Patty Cannon's reign of terror along the Mason-Dixon line, let me pause and ask you something. Where are you listening from right now? Is it morning, late at night, or maybe somewhere in between? I'd love to know if you're joining us from the East Coast, where these crimes once sent shivers through entire communities, or perhaps from somewhere far away. Drop a comment below and let me know. The discovery of those hidden graves did more than shock the public. It tore open the veil that had protected Cannon's network for years. For over a decade, her crimes flourished in the shadows, shielded by tangled jurisdictional lines, racial prejudice, and the heartbreaking reality that most of her victims were people whose disappearances were rarely noticed by white society. The place where Cannon built her empire of fear was no accident. In the early 1800s, the small community known as Reliance sat at the crossroads of 3 jurisdictions, Sussex County in Delaware, and Caroline and Dorchester counties in Maryland. It was the perfect location for criminals. A fugitive could simply step across a county line or even a state boundary and escape the reach of pursuing sheriffs. Locals called it Johnson's Crossroads, named for the tavern that would one day serve as the headquarters of the most infamous kidnapping ring in American history. And the land itself seemed almost designed to keep secrets. Thick forests of pine and oak stretched for miles in every direction. Marshlands cut across the countryside, isolating farmsteads so thoroughly that cries for help would vanish into the trees unheard. The Nanticoke River wound quietly through the region, providing smugglers with a natural waterway to transport captives under cover of night. Roads were little more than dirt paths, and the nearest sizable towns were days away on horseback. For someone intent on operating outside, the Law Reliance was a fortress of shadows. It was here in this hidden borderland that Martha Cannon, known to friends and foes alike as Patty, appeared sometime around 1790. Her origins remain uncertain. Records suggest she may have been born around 1760 under the name Lucretia Patricia Hanley, though she always kept her early life shrouded in mystery. Some said she was born in Canada and immigrated to Delaware as a teenager. What history can confirm is her marriage to Jesse Cannon, a quiet, local farmer. Together, Patty and Jesse raised at least one daughter and lived a life that seemed, at least on the surface, ordinary. Neighbors described Jesse as a man who kept to himself content to work his modest farm, tending to corn and tobacco like so many other settlers in the region. Their homestead straddled the very line between Delaware and Maryland. A small detail at the time, but one that would later give Patty Cannon an almost supernatural ability to evade the law. The Cannon home itself appeared ordinary at first glance, a modest two-story farmhouse of timber built in the common style of the early 1800s. Its walls were thick, its windows small, and from the outside, it seemed no different than dozens of other rural dwellings scattered across the borderlands. But appearances can deceive. Within those wooden walls, Patty Cannon would carve out secret chambers and hidden compartments. Spaces meant not for storage or safety, but for the concealment of kidnapped human beings. Beneath the mask of domestic simplicity lurked something far more sinister. The early decades of the 19th century were a turning point in the story of American slavery. When Congress outlawed the importation of enslaved Africans in 1808, the booming cotton fields of Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia were suddenly starved for labor. Yet demand did not shrink, it skyrocketed. A healthy young man or woman who might once have sold for $300 could now fetch more than $1,000 in the Deep South. That staggering profit margin turned human lives into currency, and it created a dark invitation for criminals willing to exploit misery for gain. The cotton gin had transformed the South's economy into one ravenous machine, hungry for hands to work the fields. And since no new enslaved people could legally come from Africa, the supply had to be found within America itself, whether through natural increase among enslaved families or through the brutal kidnapping and re-enslavement of free African Americans. The Delmarva Peninsula became a hunting ground for such predators. After the Revolutionary War, many enslaved people in Maryland and Delaware had been freed through gradual emancipation laws or through the wills of individual slaveholders. By the early 1800s, these states had thriving communities of free black laborers, artisans, and farmers. They lived independent lives, but also lived under a cloud of constant fear. Their freedom was fragile. They could not vote. They could not serve on juries, and perhaps most dangerously in many courts, they could not testify against white defendants. Their liberty was always conditional, subject to challenge at any moment. They were required to carry papers proving their free status, papers that could be stolen or destroyed. If they disappeared, white authorities rarely looked for them. To kidnappers like Patty Cannon, these men, women and children were the perfect targets, visible enough to seize yet invisible enough to vanish without consequence. And into this climate of exploitation and racial vulnerability stepped Patty Cannon herself, a woman who embodied the truth that evil respects no boundaries of gender. Contemporary accounts describe her as a large, imposing figure standing close to 6 feet tall in an age when most women barely reached 5. She was broad-shouldered, unusually strong, and carried herself with a presence that unsettled those around her. Her voice, neighbors said, was deep and commanding, a voice that left little doubt. She expected obedience. When crossed, she was prone to sudden violent rages. Her husband, Jesse Cannon, a quiet farmer, died under suspicious circumstances around 1826. Whispers later suggested that Patty had poisoned him, though no court ever proved it. What his death did accomplish, however, was to leave Patty a widow with full control of the Cannon homestead land that straddled 2 states and would serve as the perfect foundation for her empire of crime. By this point, Patty was no stranger to underworld dealings. She had already begun weaving together the criminal alliances that would soon make her name synonymous with terror across the Mason-Dixon line. And in the isolated borderlands, she found the perfect environment. Law enforcement was thin to non-existent. The sheriffs who did operate in the countryside were often corrupt or too intimidated to act. Others were simply overwhelmed by the scale of the problem. The region's population was sparse and transient. Small farmers, wandering laborers, men and women escaping deaths or past scandals from more settled towns. With so little social cohesion, neighbors minded their own business. Suspicion seldom turned into accusation, and silence became a shield. And it was within this silence, this culture of indifference, that Patty Cannon thrived. The transformation of Patty Cannon from a widowed frontier woman to the mastermind of one of America's most feared criminal networks began not with her own direct actions, but through the marriages of her daughters. What might have seemed like ordinary unions at the time would in truth weave the threads of a 2-decade reign of terror. Both young women married men who were already entangled in the brutal trade of kidnapping free African Americans. The first, Henry Harry Breton, was a blacksmith by trade, but the forge was only part of his livelihood. Behind the clang of hammer and iron, Breton maintained a far more sinister sideline, capturing free black men, women and children to sell into slavery in the Deep South. In 1811, Breton's double life finally caught up with him. He was arrested in Georgetown, Delaware for kidnapping. But the iron bars of a county jail could not contain him. He escaped the very same year. And yet, his reputation for lawlessness had long preceded his arrest. As a blacksmith, Breton traveled widely through farms and villages, repairing tools, shoeing horses, and offering services that made him welcome in households across the region. This mobility gave him the perfect cover. While working, he took note of families who had teenage children, which households seemed vulnerable, which young men might fetch a high price on the slave markets of Mississippi or Georgia. The methods of kidnappers like Breton were simple but devastatingly effective. They relied on deception and brute force, exploiting the isolation of rural communities. One common scheme was to approach free black families with offers of employment in distant towns or farms. For parents desperate to provide opportunities for their children, such offers could sound like salvation. Only later would they discover they had unknowingly signed away their children to lives of bondage. It was after Breton's escape that the first documented murder connected directly to the Cannon family occurred. Working alongside Patty Cannon herself and another criminal, Joseph Griffith Breton, ambushed a rival trader known as Rigdal at Cannon's Tavern. The plan was as brutal as it was straightforward. Get Rigdal drunk, rob him of his money and his enslaved captives, and then eliminate him to erase all witnesses. Court records tell the rest. Rigdal was shot and killed during the robbery. Breton and Griffith were eventually captured, tried and hanged on April 13, 1813. But Patty Cannon, who had helped lure Rigdal into the trap, escaped prosecution entirely. This was a turning point. Until then, Cannon's property had served mainly as a hideout and meeting place for kidnappers, a way station in a growing criminal trade. But the Rigdal murder revealed something new, a willingness to shed blood for profit. From this moment on, violence became a defining feature of Cannon's operations. Contemporary newspapers described the crime in chilling detail. Riddle, they wrote, had been traveling through the region with a considerable sum, between $3,000 and $5,000 in cash meant to purchase enslaved people. Believing Cannon's Tavern to be a safe stop, he ate, drank, and lodged there for the night. But while he slept upstairs, his killers moved in. Neighbors later told of hearing shouts, the sound of a struggle, and finally, a single gunshot cutting through the night. By morning, Rigdal was dead, his money gone, his wagon and horses vanished. His body was buried hastily on Cannon land, inaugurating a grim tradition of using the property as a dumping ground for victims. Breton's execution might have ended Patty Cannon's involvement in crime. For many, such a brutal loss, the hanging of a son-in-law, might have been reason to retreat. But for Cannon, it had the opposite effect. She did not see a cautionary tale in Breton's fate. Instead, she drew a different lesson that success in crime required more discipline, tighter planning, and greater organization. When her daughter remarried this time to Joseph Johnson, Patty Cannon found not just another accomplice, but a true partner in enterprise. Johnson was not merely a kidnapper, he was a strategist, a businessman. He understood the logistics of trafficking human beings across counties and states. And with his knowledge, Patty Cannon's shadow empire would only grow stronger. If you lived in a small village back then, do you think you would have discovered the hidden intrigue going on in a seemingly ordinary pub? Joseph Johnson proved to be the missing piece in Patty Cannon's growing empire. He brought with him something more valuable than brute strength or reckless daring. He had connections stretching deep into the South, an experienced understanding of transportation and logistics, and most importantly, the money needed to transform petty kidnappings into a full-scale criminal operation. At the center of their enterprise stood Joe Johnson's Tavern, a building unlike any other. Positioned directly on the Delaware-Maryland state line, it was more than just a roadside inn. Different rooms of the tavern literally sat in different states. This peculiar geography gave the Cannon-Johnson gang a powerful shield against law enforcement. If Delaware sheriffs burst in with warrants, the suspects needed only to step across a threshold into the Maryland half of the tavern and claim immunity from Delaware's jurisdiction. For criminals, it was genius. For their victims, it was a nightmare. the tavern wore the perfect mask of legitimacy. On the surface, it was a respectable business, a place for weary travelers to find food, drink, and a bed. Its bustling activity explained the constant flow of wagons and unfamiliar faces moving through the property. But beneath this ordinary exterior, the building served far darker purposes. It was a holding pen for human beings. Hidden cellars and secret chambers had been built into its foundations, designed to muffle sound and prevent escape. Concealed entrances led down to underground rooms where captives waited in chains for transport south. Iron rings were set into the stone walls to anchor restraints. Small ventilation shafts allowed air to flow just enough to keep victims alive during long periods of confinement. Imagine, if you will, the cries of children or the whispered prayers of mothers echoing through those stone walls. Sounds never meant to reach the outside world. The tavern also became a headquarters, a neutral ground, where the gang's diverse collection of criminals gathered. And diverse they were. There were white criminals like Henry Carr, who dealt directly with southern buyers. There were mixed-race scouts like John Pennell, who moved between worlds wearing new names and new identities as easily as changing a coat. There were even enslaved men, forced to participate in the capture of others, coerced into turning against their own communities. This blend of races and backgrounds was no accident. It was strategy. African American members of the gang could approach potential victims without raising immediate suspicion, while their white counterparts negotiated with plantation owners in Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia. Among them, John Pennell was particularly valuable. Court records describe him as a yellow man or mulatto. His light complexion allowed him to slip seamlessly between communities. At times, he presented himself as a free black man seeking work. At others, he passed as a light-skinned white businessman. This ability to shift identities made him an ideal decoy, the first friendly face victims would meet before they were taken. As the 1820s war on the scale of the Cannon-Johnson enterprise grew into something staggering, their network stretched from Pennsylvania to Louisiana, with confirmed connections to buyers across the Gulf Coast. Victims vanished from the streets of Philadelphia, from quiet farms in Maryland, and from crossroads taverns throughout Delaware. One man who took notice was Mayor Joseph Watson of Philadelphia, a Quaker whose devotion to justice set him against the Cannon gang. Troubled by the growing number of disappearances in his city, Watson began investigating. He traced missing men and women back to the Delmarva Peninsula, uncovering evidence that pointed directly to Cannon and her associates. His reports revealed the horrifying scale of the operation. In a single year, 1825, he documented dozens of kidnappings tied to the gang, and these were not random snatches. They were carefully chosen. Young adults were the most prized, able-bodied, and able to fetch high prices in the cotton states. But children too were valuable, for they could be molded, trained, and forced to provide decades of labor. Families were studied, tracked, and selected based on vulnerability. This was no mere crime of opportunity. It was organized, systematic, and chillingly deliberate. Before we continue, pause for a moment and imagine this. You're traveling along a quiet country road in the 1820s, stopping at what looks like a safe tavern. Would you notice anything unusual? Would you sense the danger hidden beneath the floors? Or would you, like Rigdell, before trust the friendly smiles and welcoming fire, unaware of the trap you had walked into? The Cannon-Johnson gang did not choose their victims at random. They studied their communities like predators circling a herd. They knew which young men had recently lost jobs, which families were struggling to survive, and which women might be tempted by the promise of steady work in distant towns. Vulnerability was their currency. One of the most haunting testimonies comes from Lydia Smith, a 25-year-old free woman abducted in 1825. Her words, preserved in court records, pull back the curtain on the dark machinery of the Cannon gang. Lydia recalled being seized on a lonely road near Philadelphia, ambushed by multiple attackers, forced into a wagon, blindfolded and chained so tightly she could barely move. The journey lasted days. Each stop brought new terror until she finally reached the Delaware-Maryland border. First, she was held in Cannon's house, locked away in a hidden cellar. Later, she was transferred to Johnson's tavern, where she spent 5 long months in chains. Imagine that, 5 months of fear, darkness, and waiting for the day she would be marched south into permanent bondage. Her testimony reveals chilling details. The underground rooms were cramped, divided to keep men, women, and children apart, yet all bound in heavy chains, fixed to stone walls. The only light came when guards arrived with candles at feeding time. The food was scarce, the stench unbearable, the despair suffocating. Lydia described the psychological torment, living each day with the knowledge that her name, her freedom, her very identity would soon be erased. The gang had a process for this. Victims were stripped of any papers proving their free status. Personal belongings were destroyed. New names and false stories were invented so they could be sold as slaves without question. Those who resisted or clung to their real identities were beaten until their spirits broke. And here's the most unsettling part the community knew. Neighbors noticed people disappearing. They saw wagons coming and going in the dead of night. They heard rumors of hidden chambers and suspicious gatherings at Johnson's tavern. Yet most remained silent. Some even helped. Merchants sold supplies without asking questions. Informants pointed out vulnerable families, and whispers suggest that certain lawmen accepted bribes to look the other way. Why? Because the victims were African Americans. In that society, their cries carried little weight. Their lives were seen as expendable. Only when white men, slave traders carrying large sums of money vanished, did real investigations begin. The first such case appeared around 1820. A Georgia trader, sometimes recorded as Bell or Miller, vanished while passing through Cannon's territory. He carried an estimated 35,000 lalans of fortune at the time, intended for purchasing enslaved people. He was last seen at Cannon's establishment. His horse was later discovered in her possession. When questioned, Cannon calmly insisted the man had simply sailed south with his cargo. But investigators found the explanation implausible. The man had disappeared, his money gone, and Cannon's shadow loomed large over the mystery. This disappearance was not an isolated incident. It marked the beginning of a pattern of targeting slave traders themselves. And unlike the African American families whose losses were ignored, these missing men had wealthy partners and powerful backers demanding answers. For Patty Cannon, this shift would prove dangerous. Before we move on, let me ask you this. If you lived in that community and you saw wagons arriving at odd hours, would you have spoken up? Or would you have stayed silent, afraid to challenge neighbors as ruthless as Patty Cannon? By the 1820s, The Cannon Johnson gang had moved beyond kidnapping. They had become predators, not just of free black families, but of their competitors, the very slave traders who passed through the Delmarva Peninsula with pockets heavy with gold. The method was simple, brutal, and profitable. These traders would be welcomed into Johnson's tavern under the guise of business. They'd be plied with alcohol, their tongues loosened, encouraged to boast about their travel plans and the fortunes they carried. When the moment was right, the trap snapped shut. A gunshot in the night. A struggle behind closed doors. By dawn, the trader was gone, his body buried on Cannon's property, his money fueling the gang and the enslaved people he had brought with him quietly absorbed into their own trafficking network. Think about that for a moment. A single trader might carry tens of thousands of dollars, enough to bankroll the gang for months. Killing them not only brought wealth, but eliminated rivals, leaving Cannon and her associates with a near monopoly on human trafficking in the region. But success carried a price. By the mid-1820s, Mayor Joseph Watson of Philadelphia and Governor John Andrew Schulze of Pennsylvania had begun to connect the dots. Watson, determined to protect free African Americans from disappearing, offered a reward of $500 for information, a staggering sum at the time. That kind of money loosened tongues. Former associates, bitter rivals, and even escaped captives began whispering secrets to authorities. Cannon's response was not retreat. It was escalation. She grew more violent, more paranoid, more willing to silence anyone she suspected of betrayal. It was this paranoia that would ultimately unravel her empire. And at the heart of that unraveling was a boy named Cyrus James. Cannon had purchased James when he was only 7 years old. He grew up inside her household, enslaved, shaped by her cruelty. As he matured, she forced him into the very business that defined her power. He served as a decoy, luring other African Americans into traps, helping to capture people who looked like him, who shared his heritage, his vulnerability. Can you imagine the torment of that? To be both victim and accomplice. To know that survival meant helping destroy the lives of others. James lived in a web of manipulation. Cannon alternated between treating him as a favorite and threatening him with unspeakable punishments. She promised him protection, but only if he obeyed completely. She told him betrayal would mean death, or worse, a sale to the brutal plantations of the Deep South. But as he grew older, Cyrus began to see through the lies. He could no longer stomach the screams, the chains, the graves dug in secret. He carried inside him knowledge that could bring down the entire Cannon Johnson empire. Knowledge so dangerous that speaking it out loud might cost him his life. And in time, he would decide to share it. For years, Cyrus James had stayed silent. Fear kept him loyal. Threats kept him obedient. But the memories never left him. He would later testify to sights so horrific they still chill the blood even 2 centuries later. He spoke of children murdered in cold blood, not out of rage, but calculation. A wounded child carried in Patty Cannon's apron, never to return. Infants born to kidnapped mothers, killed because they were considered too much trouble. Young men and women beaten, silenced, or eliminated if they refused to abandon their claims to freedom. James himself had been forced to bury the bodies. He knew where the graves were, because his own hands had dug the earth. And then in 1829, the ground itself betrayed Cannon, a tenant farmer, plowing a low patch of land, that had long lain unused felt his horse stumble. At first, he thought it was a sinkhole, maybe an old well. But as he dug to free the animal, his shovel struck wood, a chest. When it was pried open, what lay inside were not tools or valuables, but bones. Human bones. Authorities determined they belonged to a missing Georgia slave trader gone nearly a decade. But the chest was too well crafted, too deliberate. Its dimensions matched the length of a human body, exactly proof that this was no panicked burial. This was systematic murder. Imagine being that farmer alone in the field, staring down into a coffin-like chest, realizing you had unearthed not just a grave, but the beginning of a nightmare. That discovery set everything in motion. Authorities launched a multi-state investigation unlike anything seen before. Sheriff Joseph Houston of Sussex County, Delaware, joined forces with Maryland officials and even representatives from the Pennsylvania governor's office. For the first time, the Cannon Johnson gang wasn't just a rumor whispered in taverns. They were a target. Searches of Cannon's properties turned up more than anyone expected. Multiple burial sites, evidence of kidnappings, signs of years of careful, calculated violence. What had once been dismissed as the disappearances of suspicious people now looked like the work of a criminal empire. Patty Cannon, who had long believed herself untouchable, was about to face the one thing she could never outwit, the truth buried in her own backyard. The search for truth had begun. With broad warrants in hand, investigators were granted unprecedented power. They could dig anywhere, open anything, and seize all evidence across Cannon's properties. For years, Patty Cannon had hidden behind legal loopholes and the silence of neighbors. But now every patch of soil on her land was fair game. Then on April 3rd, 1829, everything changed. Cyrus James, the boy she had enslaved since childhood, was captured while trying to flee Delaware. Imagine his fear caught between the hangman's noose for crimes he had been forced to commit, and the unbearable weight of silence that would protect his tormentor. And so James made a decision that would rewrite history. He talked. At just 18 years old, his testimony poured out like a flood. Years of secrets, betrayals, and horrors long buried. He told investigators of murders committed at the supper table, of bodies carried out in wooden chests, of children beaten to death for refusing to break. James's words led them straight to the graves. In the garden, they unearthed the tiny body of a mixed-race child, murdered simply because Cannon suspected his father was white, perhaps even a relative of her own. The documents do not reveal the fate of the mother, leaving behind a silence that feels almost louder than words. 2 more boxes were discovered, each containing bones. James identified them. One, the remains of another child beaten to death with a piece of wood. The other, an adult with property, meaning free with wealth or documents worth stealing. Every box told the same story. Carefully constructed, precise in dimension, as though murder itself had been standardized in Patty Cannon's household. What investigators uncovered was not just a criminal operation. It was something darker, something colder. Patty Cannon was not merely a trafficker, she was a serial killer. Protected for years by greed, indifference, and her rural isolation, she had built an empire of terror, one body at a time. And now, thanks to Cyrus James, the graves were finally speaking. The graves told their story. Patterns emerged, not random, not rushed. Each body carefully placed, each box built to fit like death had been part of a cruel assembly line. And then came the most horrifying detail: some victims had been buried alive. Can you imagine that? Buried with soil still filling their lungs. As whispers turned into headlines, more witnesses stepped forward. People who had lived in Cannon's shadow for years, too terrified to speak until now. One of the bravest was Thomas Freeman, a free African American. In 1827, he had narrowly escaped the gang's trap. Promised a high-paying job on a Georgia plantation, Freeman had accepted, who wouldn't in desperate times. But during the journey, he sensed something was off. Their stories didn't add up. Their eyes betrayed them. At night, while his captors slept, he fled into the woods, alone, hunted. For days he hid before making it back to Philadelphia. His testimony painted the gang's methods in chilling detail. Fake jobs, smooth lies, and free passage that was anything but free. The investigation spread like wildfire. Delaware, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and soon Washington, D.C. Officials began to realize this was not just a local menace. This was organized crime, interstate, systematic, and deadly. What we take for granted today, federal coordination against crime, was born in part from this case. Then on April 13, 1829, history was made. A Delaware grand jury of 24 white men, farmers, merchants, professionals, returned 4 indictments for murder against Patty Cannon. Think about that, a white woman charged with murdering African Americans and mixed-race children in 1829. The times were changing, and the mountain of evidence was impossible to ignore. The charges were specific, each with a date and victim. An infant girl, April 26, 1822. A young boy, same day. An adult man, October 1st, 1820. A Negro boy, June 1st, 1824. Each charge carried the death penalty. Unlike most cases of the era built on whispers, rumors, and circumstantial testimony, this case had it all: physical evidence, corroborating witnesses, and the chilling confessions of a boy who had lived inside the nightmare itself. That boy was Cyrus James. His words, his memories, his directions to the graves, he became the spine of the prosecution. A child once enslaved and forced to participate in evil, now the key to dismantling it. Delaware had never seen a witness like him before, and with his testimony, the walls of Patty Cannon's empire finally crumbled. But fate denied the public their spectacle. As the trial loomed, rumors swirled around Georgetown. Crowds gathered daily outside the Sussex County Jail, some demanding justice, others curious to see the infamous woman whose name had become a curse along the Maryland-Delaware border. Yet Patty Cannon never stood before a jury. On May 11th, 1829, just weeks after her indictment, jailers entered her cell to find her lifeless body sprawled on the straw floor. In her hand, a small vial. She had swallowed poison arsenic according to most accounts. Had she smuggled it in? Had an ally passed it through the bars? Or had corrupt jail staff been bribed? No one ever discovered the truth. What is certain is that Cannon, who had inflicted terror for decades, chose her own end rather than face the rope. To the very last moment, she denied wrongdoing. Witnesses later recalled that even as death overtook her, she muttered that she had done nothing more than protect her business. Her suicide stunned the community. Many felt cheated of the justice they had awaited. Others whispered that the devil himself had claimed her before human law could. Her body was buried in an unmarked grave near the Georgetown jail. Local law says that when the jail yard was later renovated, workers unearthed a skull with a row of teeth filed to sharp points. Some swore it was Patty Cannon's, others dismissed it as myth, but the legend only deepened. What remained undeniable was the legacy: dozens of murdered victims, countless others kidnapped and sold into slavery, and a community scarred by years of fear. The Cannon-Johnson gang was finished, but their crimes cast a long shadow over the Delmarva Peninsula, and Patty Cannon herself passed into American folklore not just as a criminal, but as a symbol of how greed, racism, and impunity can breed true monstrosity. And then, it all ended on a gloomy morning, on May 11th, 1829, just 3 weeks before the historic trial began. Guards entered the cell and found Patty Cannon lying motionless on the cold stone floor. In her hand was a small vial containing traces of arsenic. Cannon had chosen her own death. Some believe that her accomplices had smuggled the poison in, others that she had it hidden in her person all along. But no one knows for sure. What is known is that rather than stand in the dock, rather than let the jury and the community see her downfall, Cannon decided to end things the way she wanted. What do you think? Was this a cowardly escape or the ultimate testament to her stubbornness and cruelty until her last breath? Cannon's death robbed her victims and their families of the chance to see justice served. But it also brought to a close one of the most notorious organized crime rings in early America. Without her, the monster of Delmarva was beheaded. But don't think the darkness disappeared immediately. Cannon's son-in-law and chief associate, Joseph Johnson, fled south and was never heard from again. Joseph's brother Ebenezer Johnson also disappeared in the Mississippi. None of them were ever brought to justice. Only Cyrus James remained the boy who had been enslaved and forced to participate in the crimes. It was Cyrus's testimony that broke the veil of secrecy, releasing many buried truths. And instead of paying for the crimes he had been forced to commit, Cyrus was set free. Cyrus was taken to Pennsylvania, where abolitionists helped him start a new life under a new name. Some later documents even recorded that Cyrus became a guide for the Underground Railroad, using his knowledge of human trafficking to fight it to save other people. In the darkness of crime, at least, there was a glimmer of light. What time are you watching this video? And where? Imagine if you were alive in 1829 and heard that the witch of Delmarva died in prison. How would you feel? Leave your thoughts in the comments section. The bigger system Cannon was just one link in the reverse Underground Railroad, a brutal mirror of the slave-running network that helped runaway slaves escape to freedom, laws and failures. The case exposed legal loopholes, racism and law enforcement in the early 19th century, allowing the crime to run rampant for nearly 20 years. Horrifying legacy Johnson's Crossroads became so infamous that it was renamed Reliance, but Cannon's memory never faded. Her skull was even displayed in a library as a horrific relic, small turning point. The prosecution, however belated, marked a raw recognition that free African Americans deserved legal protection. The documentation and later investigations into Patty Cannon's crimes did more than simply close the book on one of the most violent criminal enterprises of early America. They became a weapon for the abolitionist movement. The shocking details of her kidnappings, how swiftly and silently free African Americans could be reduced to slavery, offered undeniable proof that the institution itself was corrupt to its core. Cannon's story became a rallying point, a warning that what was happening in the borderlands was not isolated, but a symptom of something much larger and far more dangerous. In the years after Cannon's death, her name slipped into folklore, though always wrapped in distortion. Fact blurred into fiction, and the truth of her crimes was tangled with sensational tales designed to both horrify and sell. Pamphlets, local papers, and books spread her legend far and wide. The most famous retelling came decades later in George Alfred Townsend's novel, The Untailed Hat. Published in 1884, a work that exaggerated and dramatized her life but never strayed far from the chilling reality of frontier violence. The Cannon House itself, standing on that remote patch of land, became a dark tourist site. Visitors traveled long distances to see the walls that once imprisoned stolen men, women, and children. Local residents turned it into an industry of memory, guiding tours, selling tokens, and repeating half-true stories. Even after the house was finally torn down in 1948, the land did not lose its pull. Curiosity seekers continued to arrive, drawn by the shadow of evil that seemed to linger. But here's the most unsettling truth this case leaves behind. Society allowed Patty Cannon to thrive. She operated openly for decades, and why? Because her earliest victims were people the system chose not to see as fully human. Only when her cruelty spilled over onto white victims, when their disappearances threatened the interests of white traders, did the law decide to act. The same courts that ignored kidnapped free black families suddenly discovered urgency and justice. What we are left with is not just a story of a criminal, but a mirror of the time itself. It reveals the human capacity for evil, yes, but also the fragility of justice when society refuses to protect its most vulnerable. And still, how many victims remain unnamed, forgotten, swallowed in silence? The voices of hundreds were lost, and all we hold now are fragments. So, let me ask you as you sit with this story tonight, what do you think? Do you believe we truly know the full extent of Patty Cannon's network? Or do you suspect, as many historians quietly suggest, that her gang was only a single strand in a far larger web of trafficking that stretched well beyond the Delaware-Maryland border? Leave your thoughts in the comments, I'd love to hear them. And also, since we've shared this dark piece of history together, let me ask, where are you watching from and what time is it as you're listening? Is it late at night or early in the morning where you are? If you found yourself drawn into this tale and you'd like to wander deeper into the forgotten crimes of America's past, don't forget to subscribe to Sleepy History Tales. Tap the bell so you don't miss the next story waiting in the shadows. And share this with a friend who also loves unsettling mysteries, the ones history almost tried to erase. I'll see you in the next video where we'll explore another chilling account, another true story of darkness that hides just beneath the surface of our history. The story of Patty Cannon is not only a tragedy of innocent people disappearing into the darkness, but also a reminder that society will always have hidden corners where evil can thrive when the pain of the weak is ignored. From those bloody pages of history, we see a clear truth only when crime touches the interests of the powerful. Justice begins to speak. And that is the haunting that still lingers to this day. What do you think? Has everything about Patty Cannon's criminal network ever been fully exposed? Or are there still secrets that have never been revealed? Leave your comments below sharing your thoughts and feelings about this dark chapter in American history. Before ending, I want to send my sincere thanks to all of you, the viewers who have accompanied and helped the channel reach the 1,000 subscriber mark. This is an important milestone, and it is your support that gives me the strength to continue telling mysterious, creepy, and thoughtful stories from forgotten history. If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe, turn on the notification bell and share so more people can know about it. See you in the next video, where we will explore another mystery together from the scariest hidden corners of history.